All right, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you all so much for taking the time out of your Tuesday evening to join us for this webinar, Carbon Gardening, Local Models for Replication, which is made possible by the City of Petaluma, so a lot of gratitude to the City of Petaluma for making this and much of our other work possible. My name is Connor Devane. I'm a programs coordinator with Daily Acts. I see that we have some local folks and some people from last week, so some of you may be familiar with us, but for those of you who aren't, Daily Acts is an environmental education nonprofit that takes a heart-centered approach to inspiring transformative actions that create connected, equitable, and climate-resilient communities. We believe in the power of our daily actions to reconnect people to self, community, and to place, which in turn heal our society and our planet. Our approach starts in the soil and swells into culture and policy change. So we spread solutions and models, giving people the skills and tools to conserve resources while growing food, habitat, carbon, medicine, and community. Because change happens through collaboration, we also invest in strengthening community leadership by equipping leaders who understand the intersections between social, economic, and environmental justice issues through our networks, alliances, and leadership programs. All that coalesces into building public and political will, mobilizing our community's power towards climate and environmental justice policies. So we host over 100 programs a year. We've been at it for 18 years at this point. So as you can imagine, our impacts have been diverse and far-reaching, and we're really grateful that you're joining us to be part of that, and we're excited to continue that work in the future. So before we launch into the good stuff here, just a quick note on some Zoom etiquette. I imagine we're, for the most part, pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, but just in case, we are going to have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question, we really would like for you to use the question and answer box so that we can track your questions, make sure everything gets answered. If questions come up that are particularly relevant to any given presentation, we may pose those during transitions between presenters, but for the most part, we're going to save them towards the end. You can also put your questions into the chat window, but as I mentioned, there's the chance they might get lost in the shuffle that way. That said, we do encourage you to use the chat box. You know, if you see someone else engaging in the chat box that you know and you want to say hi or you want to share an idea, that's the place to do it. Just make sure that down in the chat window, there's a little drop-down menu that you can choose the settings so that your chat goes to all panelists and attendees so that we can have a conversation. With that, I have the honor of briefly introducing our panelists, and then we'll get into it. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Amy Drew of Mycelium Youth Network, Trevor Probert of Stop Waste, and Anthony Myant from Zero Foodprint. So Amy, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, I will read some nice things about you real quick. So Amy Drew is a climate resiliency educator and soil health advocate, currently working with Mycelium Youth Network on youth outreach, scientific literacy, and environmental justice. As an educator, Amy has taught hundreds of East Bay students the basics of the carbon cycle, photosynthesis, and the power of healthy soils. She holds a BS in chemistry from UC Davis, and she's currently part of the Kiss the Ground soil advocacy cohort, and a future participant in the compost operations training course hosted by the U.S. Compost Council. Amy, thank you so much for being here tonight. And with that, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Let me get myself going here. Hi, thank you guys so much. I'm so excited to be here talking with you guys. Thank you so much for the introduction, Connor. Yeah, so my name is Amy. I started working with Mycelium Youth Network in a bit of a, as an educator and kind of contracted advisor position about a year ago. and have been really excited by the work that they've been doing, and am looking forward and looking for more opportunities to try and expand some of their curricula. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First, before we start things off, I want to make sure people know, give a little bit of a rundown of what carbon gardening is, and what we're talking about here today. Those are just where I'm from: CASA, UC Davis, SRJC. Here's what I'll be talking about today: carbon gardening, Mycelium Youth Network in general, the successes and challenges of working in youth education, specifically around climate resilience, social justice, scientific literacy, and then throwing COVID and pandemic lockdown on top of all of that. It's been interesting. And then finally, we'll end with a little bit of a call to action. So for anyone who hasn't watched Kiss the Ground yet, or wasn't able to attend last week's discussion, carbon gardening is really it's a at-home way that you can start building healthy soils and building the carbon back into our soils where they're desperately missing from. A good place to start off with is, sorry, wrong one. We're talking about how carbon is actually not the enemy. Uh-oh, can you see that? There we go. Carbon is not the enemy. It often gets a bad rap because we think about carbon in the atmosphere as being the major component of what's causing greenhouse gas, causing global warming. But in reality, we're carbon-based life forms, and the definition of life as we know it is based entirely on carbon. Our current problem is really comes down to a mismanagement of carbon and a disequilibrium between all of the different carbons, the 5 different carbon sinks on the planet. This slide here shows a little bit, just to kind of breaks down some of those numbers. As you can see, the atmosphere has more than the biosphere, which is all of our plant material. But the pedosphere, which is considered anything that's underground, fossils, soils, rocks, minerals, that has a huge amount of carbon stored, and it actually has unlimited potential for carbon storage, which is something that we're finding out as we continue to study soil health and carbon management techniques. Here, what it really comes down to between these two images, as you can see here, we have dirt and we have soil. The difference between those two things is the carbon and how the amount of carbon that is in each of those substances and the life that's associated with it. Dirt is devoid of pretty much anything that we can consider life, whereas soil is teeming with microbes. And something that is often tossed around is, in healthy soil, in 1 tablespoon of healthy soil, there are more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. So that's a pretty powerful thing when you think about it, if we can actually start wielding that power and using it properly. This is just a little brief 6 principles of regenerative agriculture. Not tilling land for least disturbance, avoiding, building soil armor, increasing biodiversity, keeping living roots in the system is huge. Animal integration goes along with increased biodiversity, and then looking at the context of the issues and thinking about them in real world systems. Now, what carbon gardening means for the everyday person is a little bit different, because when we think about regenerative agriculture, we think about it as this kind of like broad, large scale industrial agriculture movement, which it is, but it also is really beautiful in that you can distill it down to smaller and more local levels. And just really briefly, these is just, I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but really I just wanted to give you guys kind of a overview, and I'll have links to this later if you want to keep looking at it. But the 10 things that we can do every day in our lives, especially if you have any land accessible to you, which is huge and something that is not always considered, whether or not people have land. But growing edible plants, growing a food forest is one of the number 1 things. Keeping soils covered through cover cropping and crop rotation is another excellent way of being able to maintain the carbon that's in the soil. Composting and applying compost as an alternative to fertilizers is huge for a number of reasons. I could talk about compost all day, but we'll say that for another time. Encouraging biodiversity both above ground and then also within our microbes by keeping a really robust level of plants and critters that can kind of, that interact with the soil, because it really is a very dynamic ecosphere. Perennial crops are huge because of the longer lasting root systems. Having them being in the ground, having roots in the ground all the time will allow you to sequester more carbon over time. Ditching chemicals is one that I think we all know a lot about. Daily Acts has done some amazing work at adding education and spreading awareness about the difficulties that come with overuse of chemicals. Crop and animals, integrating crops and animals, using people power instead of mechanization, all of those things reduce carbon emissions. And then getting to know your garden, really spending some time and looking at how different systems work and what things thrive with in what areas and what things don't work so well. One of the things that was mentioned that I'll just go in a little bit more deeply on is the roots. It all starts with the roots and native versus non-native species. Now, granted, this graphic is not local to Sonoma County. It is actually up in, I believe, in Winnipeg, in Canada. But the premise is the same. So whenever you bring an invasive or non-native species that's not adapted and hasn't evolved for that particular environment, you're going to have a less robust and less efficient system. What we're finding with carbon soil sequestration is that with the longer, deeper root systems, you're actually able to store more carbon deeper in the ground, where it has less of a chance of getting tilled up and oxidized and released back into the atmosphere. Again, on the similar note, planting annuals versus perennials. Again, you can imagine if something's being taken out every year, it doesn't have a chance to grow that really long root system. And I'm just giving you guys all a little bit of a brief on this, like I said, just to as a summary, and then also to kind of show you a little bit what I do when I'm talking with kids and when I'm talking with youth from ages, let's see, 7 to high school age, to 17. And obviously that varies a lot depending on the group, but really at the end of the day, the information is the same and it's not that hard to explain. And kids are so adaptive and so ready to learn, especially about the things around the natural world that they can see and they can touch and they can experience. So it's been really exciting. Really, it's one of the beautiful things about talking about carbon sequestration and regenerative agriculture and climate resilience is that the conversation doesn't vary that much depending on who you're talking to. We're all learning this right now, and we're all trying to figure out how we can play a part in bringing this about in a more meaningful and transformative system. Again, just a final talking point on why healthy soils are so important. Climate change mitigation, reduced water demand, improving community health is huge and something that we're really trying to advocate for and push as another one of the many positive cascading benefits of regenerative agriculture, especially in this time when community health and public health is at the forefront of so many minds. So Mycelium Youth Network, let's get down to brass tacks. Mycelium Youth Network was founded in 2017 by an amazing woman named Lil Milagro Henriquez, who decided to start this organization out of finding that there was a need for education about climate resilience and disaster preparedness in the scope of a climate challenged future, climate challenged world, which is what we are facing now and what young people will continue to face for even longer than us. And so Mycelium Youth Network really focuses on integrating these 3 strands of knowledge, which are ancient, ancestral, indigenous wisdom, applied science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and climate and community resilience. Now, Mycelium Youth Network was founded in Oakland, and the schools that is currently working with 9 schools in the immediate Oakland area, as well as a few in the South Bay. And they're all Title I schools, where students are often dealing with the actual real life repercussions of climate change for many other people are. Many of people in Sacramento and people in Washington who are making policy changes. It's common knowledge amongst, I think, within this community, and certainly among students and kids and teachers, that they know that they are at the front lines of this climate, environmental racism and climate catastrophe. And the thing I think that's struck Lil and the people who first started with Mycelium Youth Network was that kids are very perceptive. They know what's going on, and they were scared. And that was a lot of why Lil founded this wonderful organization, was to equip students with both information and knowledge, connecting them to their roots, many of which hadn't been represented or seen within their own typical kind of California standard curricula, and empowering them to really be able to affect change and to take care of themselves going forward. And yeah, it's heavy. It's a lot of stuff to think about, and it's heavy when you think about it from the perspective of kids. And that's one of the missions here of Mycelium, is to really provide a space and a way for students to actually affect change and to make their voices heard, because they really do have pretty visionary ideas when it comes down to it. Another really important factor of Mycelium Youth Network is that all of the, almost all the staff, the entire board of directors, and most of the advisors are all Black, Indigenous people of color. And it was a really important founding principle for Lil that, and everyone involved with Mycelium Youth Network, that students see themselves represented at all levels of leadership, and to be having amazing success. This is just a brief introduction on Mycelium Youth Network's programming. I'm happy to share these slides later for anyone who would like to learn a little bit more. They go through a basic program of talking about water is life, clean air is a right, mapping your neighborhood, because something that we, especially in Sonoma County, take for granted is the access to nature that we have in these more rural areas. In inner city Oakland, tough to find a biodiversity, especially if you don't live near a park or don't have access to getting outdoors to nature on a regular basis. So teaching students to connect with what's around them in their immediate neighborhoods from either a medicinal or edible plant background is, it's empowering, and it's important knowledge to pass along. The program specifically that I have been helping with and advising with is the Growing Our Health program, which is a kind of download on climate change, carbon sequestration, and the power of healthy soils for clean air, clean water, clean food, clean, healthy communities, and a livable planet. And that's been really exciting. And kids are eating it up. They really are. It's really, really empowering to watch. So one of the things that I wanted to just briefly talk about was this project that we did just about a year ago at Pear Tree Community School. And it was a partnership between Mycelium Youth Network, Pear Tree Community School, and the Carbon First Initiative. And the idea there was that this was going to be the first school implemented carbon monitoring system within a school garden. Pear Tree Community School did have a garden as it stood, but it was in disrepair, and they didn't have the funds to renovate it or make it usable or functional, really. So this was in a way to get some grant money involved, increase students' access to scientific literacy, and start trying to see if we can actually start mapping and monitoring carbon on a small scale, because the work that was done by the Marine Carbon Project 10 years ago was amazing. And it's such a good, powerful way to teach students about science and data analysis. It's fallen into a little bit of a slump, as one might imagine, considering only 4 months after we built all of the beds and built out this amazing garden, garden laboratory, I would call it. Everything shut down. And I'd be happy to update anyone on where that stands right now, but there were certainly some challenges. But anyways, really well. The organization, the day consisted of building out garden beds, filling them with with pollinator plants, medicinal herbs and flowers, and also edible plants. There also was a component about kitchen herbalism, making salves and making your own at-home vinegar cleaners, to really show kids that you can do stuff without having to go to the store and buy toxic chemicals that's wrapped in plastic, if that's what you want. There was also a component on indigenous weaving techniques. They built out the whole back of the garden. It was really an amazing day. And I had the honor of being there talking to kids in small groups about carbon sequestration and about compost and about carbon gardening, basically, and explaining to them how what they were doing outside in their school was actually affecting the planet and affecting climate change. And they were really responsive, I have to say. This next slide, this young girl, she was about 8 years old, and she just got it right away, man. She just wanted to immediately start writing it out, and she'd say, okay, so this, she'd explain it back to me and say, okay, this goes there and that happens because of this. And I'd say, no, you're gonna, and I mean, by the end of it, she could explain photosynthesis, carbon sequestration, and climate change better than a lot of adults that I know. So they're here and they want to learn. They really, really do. Another project I was involved with Mycelium Youth Network was speaking at a Youth versus Apocalypse climate strike, another really powerful youth-led youth organization that basically tries to prepare kids, speaking about social justice, racial inequality, and then above all, climate change and the need for action on climate change. Again, super responsive. This is great, right? It sounds like it's all hunky-dory. Students are more engaged and more desperate than ever for action and to see something that they can look forward to and be hopeful for. They have an amazing energy for climate, social, and political transformation, and really some truly visionary and powerful ideas. Where we come to a head and where we tend to find obstacles is in commitment and in continuity from the perspective of schools or school districts or educators at large, where often what I've heard both from my experiences with Mycelium and other local education outreach organizations is that we may have the best intentions by setting up a school garden or building a vermicomposting bin, but unless there is somebody there who can teach the material to the kids and keep them engaged and tend to this living outdoor laboratory classroom that I think a lot of us are hoping to build, it often can fall into disrepair and become an eyesore or just a underutilized space. So when I talk with kids and when I talk with educators about in similar positions to myself, what I keep hearing is that students want something to rally behind. They are passionate about this and they want the tools and the platform to be able to commit and take action. Beyond that, they need a platform to participate. And that doesn't just mean having a seat at the table. It means having a space designed specifically with their thoughts, their inputs, and their goals in mind, and really at the center of this discussion. Another thing that I hear often, and obviously is changing every day as we continue to figure out how to teach in socially distant ways, students want real life experiences and real life skills. And I personally can't think of many better than being able to grow your own food and being able to replenish the land that you live on, and give back to the land. I remember in high school, people always complaining, why didn't they teach me how to do my taxes? Well, why don't they teach you how to grow your own food? You know, there's ways, and I think the moment is primed right now to really start looking at how we can meet the needs of our students at a more profound level. These are just some kids who are involved with Mycelium Youth Network, either through their schools or through the after-school programming that Mycelium offers. And as Moya says, we are the future and we need to fix climate change and the pollution of the earth. They are thinking about this, they really are. And we are doing them a disservice as educators and adults by not providing space and tools for them to participate in their future. Now, what you can do, it's going to be similar to all calls to action, but educating yourself and educating those you know, whether it's by showing them this documentary, Kiss the Ground, or exposing them to regenerative systems in everyday life. Advocacy is huge. Advocating with your local schools, your local board of directors, to fight for building climate resilience and social justice into standardized California curricula. That's the big goal, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and institutional, I don't know, institutions that make that difficult and very slow going, when what we're hearing from both the planet and from our students is that the time is now. The other thing is always donate. All of these, Mycelium Youth Network included, is a nonprofit, and we're able to fund this work and these curricula that we bring to people, mainly through fundraising and donations. Again, a little bit more just about how to act now. If you personally can donate your own time or your own funds to an organization or school that currently supports climate education and scientific literacy, it's amazing. Talking to your local school board, contacting your legislators about redirecting more funding towards this type of education is paramount, and really one of the most direct paths to try and get this kind of rolled out on a larger scale. The other thing is organizing a community work day for a school that might have a garden that needs some work or is interested in, building one for themselves. Last thing I'll just mention real quick, this is Mycelium Youth Network's fundraising event for the year. It's a apocalyptic climate resilience D&D game, all virtual. It sounds so cool. I don't know if I want to sign up for the kids version or the adult version personally, but there's going to be breakout sessions for kids where they can learn different skills about, upcycling clothing that translates into a, building out their body armor for their character, for their D&D character, or building first aid kits for themselves as a part of disaster preparedness, which is a cornerstone of their Mycelium Youth Network's Science for Survival program. All these things, it's really thoughtful. It's gonna be really fun. It's 2 days. I promise the stuff that's for adults is really interesting too. And yeah, if you can afford to support, fantastic. And we'd love to have you there as part of it. And I think with that, I'll just give a few credits and thank Daily Act so much for hosting this event. Kiss the Ground, Mycelium, the Carbon First Initiative, and all of you for listening in. Please feel free to email me with any questions or follow-ups. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was excellent. As both a former educator and a big tabletop role-playing game nerd, there's so much in there that I'm excited about, but I'll save it for the Q&A. Now I would love to introduce our next presenter, Trevor Probert, who is an outreach coordinator for composting and carbon farming at Stop Waste in Alameda. Trevor manages Stop Waste's partnerships with urban farms, as well as a soil testing project to measure carbon sequestration and soil health. Welcome, Trevor. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Let me know if you can't see my slides. So thanks for having me. My name is Trevor Probert. I'm a community outreach coordinator at Stop Waste. Stop Waste is a public agency that serves communities of Alameda County on waste reduction and sustainability goals. And I have the job of providing outreach to county residents on the benefits of using compost and mulch, building healthy soil, and now most recently, sharing the potential of carbon farming. So we've approached carbon farming outreach by building relationships with urban farms in the county, working with community organizations and residents that work around the food cycle. And then we hope to build capacity for them as emerging champions of local carbon farming. And so we've developed some tools and resources for those organizations and for residents to engage with carbon farming. Those things I will share with you tonight. So our carbon farming outreach is an evolution of our previous outreach programs that have always centered around gardening. That includes the Bay Friendly Gardening Program, which is now held by a nonprofit called Rescape California, our Master Composter Program, and then most recently the Lawn to Garden Program, which mirrors a lot of the work that Daily Acts has done around sheet mulching. And so the common theme for these programs have always been centered around building healthy soil with compost and mulch and avoiding the synthetics. And carbon farming is no different in that sense. So a little bit of context about how we began work around carbon farming. Stop Waste has a carbon farming plan written for a 1,200 acre property in the Altamont Hills, which is just outside of Livermore. The plan was written by the Alameda County Resource Conservation District, and we began implementation of this plan in December of 2019, where we applied compost to 10 acres. And in the next year or two, depending on COVID, we will be applying compost to an additional 100 acres with a long-term plan of eventually doing the entire property. This project was modeled based on the Marin Carbon Project from around 2010, which, if you've never heard of the Marin Carbon Project, they really raised attention on the connection between using compost and carbon sequestration in soil. They measured that just a half-inch compost application on a soil very similar to this Altamont property was able to sequester 1.5 metric tons of carbon dioxide per acre. And they thought the data, if that could be scaled across half of California's rangeland, that it could sequester the same amount of emissions from California's entire commercial and residential energy use. So scaling up, there's a huge potential for carbon farming. Stop Waste, we had to ask ourselves the question, since we're based in Alameda County, and Alameda County is a very urban residential county, we asked ourselves, how can we introduce carbon farming to our audience, which is an urban residential audience? So we decided to center our outreach on carbon farming around building relationships with urban farms, because they are models of carbon farming practices. And if we could demonstrate that these urban farms were sequestering carbon in their soil, then they could become champions of carbon farming themselves when they interact with their network and their community. We were really intentional about working with urban farms. They are providing a ton of services, including donating produce to food banks. They're providing job training programs, K-12 garden education. They're building new vegetable garden beds for new and existing homes and apartments. Nearly all of them have active volunteer groups. They're hosting their own gardening workshops year-round. There's just tons of opportunities for us to partner with them and for them to partner with other organizations that work around the food cycle. And we had the goal of helping build the capacity of these farms. So we've done that through a few ways. We provided soil testing on their site to measure carbon sequestration, to give some clarity to the farms about the impacts of their carbon farming practices on their soil. We've provided on-site composting technical assistance to help solidify them as local composting experts. We've been co-hosting workshops with these farms for the last couple of years, and inviting and introducing residents in the county to meet these local models of carbon farming. And then in general, we've just been helping cross-promote them and connecting these farms with other organizations in the county's local food economy. So here are some photos of us doing soil testing in the field. Soil testing was our approach to try to invest the urban farms in carbon farming, and we had the intent of building a case for urban carbon farming with local soil data, because initially we were on the lookout for carbon farming data that referenced urban soils and we just didn't find any. So we decided to get our own data. And so far the results have been really promising. And so far I've confirmed the fact that all these farms that are using multiple carbon farming practices are certainly sequestering carbon. And I'm going to share some of that data with you in a moment. We've partnered with 8 farms for the soil testing project. We have partnered with more farms in some of the other services that we've been providing, like the compost technical assistance. But 8 farms for the soil testing. It's a 3-year timeline. We're in our 3rd and final year of testing. We test for soil carbon at 3 different depths in the soil, and each year of testing is paired with a compost donation to the farm. And we also keep track of all the other carbon farming practices that the farms are utilizing. So I will say, due to COVID, the labs that we're working with have delayed some of the data getting back to us, but we do have multiple years of data from one farm in particular, Fremont Leaf Stone Garden. They're a great farm to share because they are just a pure model of carbon farming. They are doing pretty much all of the practices as much as they can do. The image on the left shows the different depths that we sampled to. And on the right, you'll see how we've measured the percentage of soil carbon increase every year at the 3 different depths. Increases in soil carbon at the deeper layers of the soil, that's the most important pattern to see for long-term carbon sequestration. So that's a really good sign. And when I calculate this out, because we also measure the density of the soil, when I calculate it out, Fremont Leaf between 2018 and 2020 stored 47 metric tons of carbon dioxide over 1 acre. That's roughly equal to the same amount of emissions that 9 cars will produce in a year. So in sharing this information with Fremont Leaf, they are super proud of this fact. They're really thankful for all the co-benefits that it brings for the health of their soil. And they make it a point to share this with their audience, and they are in fact becoming a champion of carbon farming. That's the model that we want to continue building, is providing some of this data to help lift these farms up to become outspoken supporters of carbon farming. So urban farms are huge advocates for compost already, but we found that a lot of farms were dependent on purchasing compost, which especially for smaller organizations can be a real, a major expense for them. So we also found that a lot of the compostable material that they were generating on site was going into the green bin or into compost piles that were very inactive. So we provide on-site compost technical assistance that includes training, we can give a holistic support around their infrastructure and if they have a program in place. And we also troubleshoot compost piles with them. Also, because there's such a correlation between using compost and carbon farming to not only assist the farms that we work with more, but also to go beyond the farms that we have relationships with, we developed an on-farm composting toolkit, which is an in-depth guide to small and mid-scale composting. Like I said, it was written for small to mid-scale urban farms in particular, but if you're a home gardener and you really want to deep dive into composting, this is absolutely applicable to you as well. We've been working with the Alameda County Resource Conservation District to share this toolkit, not only with other farms that we don't necessarily have relationships with in the county, but there are a network of resource conservation districts that work statewide that are providing technical assistance through the California Healthy Soils Program. And so we're going to be sharing this resource with all these resource conservation districts statewide. And there's even an opportunity for us to do a Spanish translation of it, which is a really important step for providing equitable access. So the beauty of getting to know these farms is the opportunity to introduce residents to them. And that's done through co-hosting public workshops. So Stop Waste, we teach gardening workshops year round. We've found that soil health has been a really important bridging concept to explain carbon farming to home gardeners who have a wide range of understanding and knowledge about climate change and how carbon sequestration works. but everyone seems really impressed with the health of the soil at these urban farms. And when they discover the fact that, the health of the soil at these farms have been built up over time with carbon farming practices. A lot of these farms are in, there's a farm in West Oakland that was on fill, and the soil was really unhealthy to start. And when residents learn about this, it totally changes their mindsets about their own soil health as being dynamic rather than static. With the point I'll try to make is, one of the most common barriers we hear folks say about gardening at home is that they have bad soil. And so we try to emphasize, if you can just replace the term bad soil to unhealthy soil, all of a sudden, you become open to the idea that the health of your soil can be regenerated with carbon farming practices. So these workshops, they're an opportunity for us to share the soil data with residents. We give them a real reference to carbon farming at the local level, and we can ensure them that even home gardeners can be carbon farmers. Residents, when they're introduced to the urban farms, either in person or virtually, we find that they join their mailing lists, their volunteer teams, they're participating in the CSA program if they have one, or plant sales, they're attending community events, and it's just a deeper relationship with a local model of carbon farming. We also use the workshops as an opportunity to talk to folks about their city climate action plans and inform them of other city level impacts of things like SB 1383, which I'll mention near the end. So this is the list of carbon farming practices that we've sort of distilled down to being the most relevant for home gardeners. We cover these practices in our resource tools for building healthy soil, which is there on the right, and can be shared with folks. And another resource that we've recently developed, and I'm really excited about because I've put a lot of work into this, is the Healthy Soils Activity Guide. We developed this tool for a couple of reasons. First, we did a pilot project to get home gardeners to sample their soil at home for lab testing, similarly to what we were doing with the urban farms. We found that process to be a bit difficult, and from an access point of view, the results, require some interpretation, didn't make sense to home gardeners all the time. And then the second thing is that carbon farming can feel like an invisible process to observe. It's happening underground, it's an overtime sort of thing. So we developed the Healthy Soils Activity Guide to try to bring attention a bunch of indicators of soil health that are readily accessible to observe by anyone, and try to make soil health more visible. The resource, it has currently 8 soil activities that focus on various aspects of soil health. Everything is always in connection with soil organic matter and soil carbon. And ultimately, we just want home gardeners to treat their soil like carbon farmers would. And in order for them to do that, there has to be some level of exploration and learning about their soil at home. So this activity guide is our attempt at being a resource for that. The audience for this resource, it's not just home gardeners and urban farmers, but Stop Waste has a schools team. So we are working to make this more available to educators. A lot of these activities are very family friendly and definitely are great for students. I'm going to quickly showcase a couple of the activities. The first activity that I'll share is the nitty gritty. This is actually an activity developed by Life Lab in Santa Cruz. It's a great way to view your soil type, which is how much sand, silt, and clay is in your soil, but it can also be a look into the organic matter in your soil. The way it works is you mix soil and water in a jar, and by mixing it, the different layers of sand, silt, and clay will settle at different rates, and they'll separate. So you can see the example on the right. That's a sandy clay, and you can really tell the difference between the sand layer and the clay layer, both in looks and color. And we emphasize that knowing your soil type is important to understanding the tendencies of your soil. But once the nitty-gritty completely settles, like the example on the right, you can notice the color of the water. It's a peaty brown color. That color is from the dissolved organic matter in your soil. So if you were to do the nitty-gritty with a really poor soil that has really low organic matter, once all that soil has settled, you'll find that the water is nearly clear. So there's a big difference between doing this with soils that are really healthy, high organic matter, and soils that are with low organic matter. Another example of an activity in the activity guide is the worm count. It's borrowed from a field test recommended by the NRCS for farms across the country. It assesses organic matter because worms are attracted to moist soil with high organic matter. So the more worms that you can find in your soil, the higher amounts of organic matter you can expect there to be. It involves digging out a cubic foot of soil, and as you sift through the soil, counting the number of worms and worm eggs, or worm eggs that you find. And obviously, the more that you find, the more indication of organic matter that you have. I used to be an elementary school garden teacher, and so I did this activity with my students, and it was a lot of fun. And then the third activity that I'll share is called the slate test. It shows you how organic matter can improve soil structure. On the picture on the right are 2 soil samples that come from the same place, Eden Garden in Livermore, which is one of the urban farms we work with. It's the same soil, same location, same soil. The only difference between the soils is that the soil on the right, which is darker in color, is from within the garden, and it benefits from multiple carbon farming practices year round, especially compost. The soil on the left is outside the garden. It's unmanaged, just has annual weeds growing on it. The biggest difference between those 2 soils is how much organic matter is in the soil on the right. So in the slate test, you take a soil clod or an aggregate, you submerge it in water, and you make an observation of what happens as the aggregates respond to the water and as they absorb water. So the photo on the left shows what happens after an hour takes place, and you can see the soil on the right has held its form the entire hour as it's absorbing water, whereas the soil on the left, as it's absorbing water and undergoing all the pressure that places on the aggregate, soil particles are breaking off. And this is a total model for what happens in your actual soil during a heavy rain. In unhealthy soils, soil particles are breaking off, they're sinking deeper into the soil profile, and they can cause low, subsoil compaction. So just 3 examples of activities that are in the Healthy Soils Activity Guide. And we just encourage home gardeners to use these activities to learn more about their soil health. Some other things that we've been doing an annual screening of the film Symphony of the Soil. The film is made by a company in Mill Valley, Lily Film Studio, and the filmmaker is Deborah Coons Garcia. It's a great film. It does a great job of illustrating how the carbon cycle and soil health is interconnected, and it gives a bunch of different examples around the world, but also including a lot of California examples of how compost can be used to regenerate soils. And I haven't actually seen the Kiss the Ground video yet, so I can't make a direct comparison. I had heard that the Kiss the Ground video didn't give a lot of attention on compost, and I have some guesses as to why that might be the case, but Symphony of the Soil, I recommend folks checking out, especially if you're educators, if you want to find a way to share the video with others. Also, the last thing I'll mention from a program point of view for Stop Waste is we have a SWEET program, stands for the Stop Waste Environmental Educator Training. It's an in-depth 6-class program that meets at night, and we get participants to have conversations about different issues around the food cycle. And that includes modules on compost and carbon farming. It's been a great opportunity for us to form strong relationships with residents in the county. And we end up connecting to new partner organizations by meeting these folks. They help us with outreach in various ways. And we've even had city staff and urban farm managers participate in the program, which is amazing because then they get to meet each other and begin collaborating themselves totally outside of a relationship with Stop Waste. That's a huge goal of ours. Oh, well, that's silly. Click through those. So there's a lot of pressure points for communities both in Alameda County, but also in places like Petaluma or across the state to help advance carbon farming. So first of all, is that the cities in Alameda County have completed an update of their climate action plans, and nearly all the cities have included soil carbon sequestration or carbon farming as an action step. I'm not familiar with Petaluma's or other cities up here and their climate action plans, but it's for residents, it's a really important tool to utilize and see if your city has put in carbon farming into their plan. There's a lot of public land that make great carbon farming sites, especially for compost application. It can include city landscapes, parks, turf fields, sports fields. Referring back to the Stop Waste carbon farming project that I shared about the Altamont Hills, that big 1,200 acre site, we're using that project as a way to help build confidence in other public agencies. Think like regional water districts or parks districts that hold on to larger properties, and try to get them engaging in carbon farm planning. Also, I mentioned SB 1383. For folks who are unfamiliar, it's a past Senate bill. It's called the Short-Lived Climate Pollutant Strategy, and it requires statewide the diversion of organics and food waste from landfills. And it's going to be paired with an investment in composting infrastructure. And an important note about the bill is that it's going to require cities starting in 2022 to procure or obtain a certain amount of compost, mulch, and energy products derived from organic waste. So I did a little estimation. So under the current regulations, the city of Petaluma will be required to procure up to 7,000 cubic yards of compost per year. There is an asterisk next to that number because there are certain choices available to cities that might change that number. But 7,000 cubic yards can cover 53 acres in a 1-inch application of compost. So it's a lot of compost, and cities do need to develop plans for that compost or compost and mulch. There are some flexibilities on how cities use that compost, but carbon farming, we really are emphasizing that should be a natural outlet for compost. And then lastly, I just wanted to reiterate that there's a lot of pressure in California agriculture to evolve and survive a changing climate, and among other things. So we've been asking the question, can we shift where California agriculture, where organic sort of becomes the new conventional and carbon farming is beyond organic? And then can we help California residents access local farms that are growing food using regenerative systems like carbon farming? I'm really excited to hear about Anthony's work, who's up next, because I have a feeling he's going to tie into that question a lot. So I've mentioned a bunch of resources. This is the list of resources that I've mentioned. Everything is available on our website, stopwaste.org/gardening. We are a public agency, so we're government. Everything, all of our services and resources that we provide are for free, available to download as PDF. Really recommend folks go on there and use them. The upcoming film screening of Symphony of the Soil is Thursday, November 19th from 6 to 8. You'll have to register on our website if you're interested in joining us. We'll also have a worm composting webinar happening sometime in the winter. Thanks so much. There's our website again. My name is Trevor Probert. If you have any questions, you can reach me at my email, tprobert@stopwaste.org, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Trevor. That sparked a lot of exciting thoughts for me. I really love the idea of carbon farming not being restricted to agricultural land use or even home gardens, but also government-owned land. So excited to hear more in the Q&A. Now I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our last presenter, Anthony Myant. Anthony is the Director of Partnerships for Zero Foodprint, which is a name that I absolutely love. Anthony works to mobilize the restaurant industry and allies in the public and private sectors to support healthy soil as a solution to the climate crisis. He's also a chef. He won the 2019 Basque Culinary World Prize for his work with Zero Foodprint. He's co-founded many restaurants and restaurant-adjacent projects, including Mission Street Food, Mission Chinese Food, Mission Cantina, Mission Burger, Lieutenant Waffle, Commonwealth, and The Perennial. He was nominated for a James Beard Award for Outstanding Restaurateur in 2019. And in 2020, the James Beard Foundation named Zero Foodprint as Humanitarian of the Year. So Anthony, thank you for being here. And with that, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Connor. And thanks, Serena and DailyX for having me. I'm really honored to be here and excited to move forward the work that you guys are doing in Sonoma, and also collaborate on the work that we're trying to do in Sonoma and Petaluma. And thanks, Amy and Trevor, for your incredible work. And I think it's like we're pretty new to this space, like just in the last few years. And so it's always really inspiring to me to come across like kind of fellow travelers who are working on the same, basically big goals in different ways. So I'm really excited to collaborate in the future too. So I'll give a quick background first before I start my slideshow. I I'm a chef and restaurateur. We started doing pop-ups in San Francisco in 2008. Before that was even really a term, and it turned into a permanent pop-up here called Mission Chinese Food. And then it turned into a location in New York, which, ostensibly, I think you could only consider to have been in a shitty Thai takeout window. But miraculously, that won New York Times Restaurant of the Year in 2012. And we sort of found ourselves in these kind of celebrity chef circles. I feel like 2012 was peak celebrity chef. But we would be like kicking a soccer ball around with the #1 chef in the world at a chef conference, or drinking a beer with the #2 chef in the world, or this kind of like crazy stuff that we never imagined as we were starting this kind of party Chinese restaurant. But so fast forward a few years, my wife and I had a daughter, and we started really thinking a lot about the future and climate change in particular, and really realizing that we had the potential to kind of mobilize both the cultural capital of the restaurant industry and the fiscal capital towards solutions. And, for reference, like pre-coronavirus, the restaurant industry in the US was $863 billion, which is more than agriculture and more than retail. And I think the industry represented something like 1 out of 10 members of the workforce in the US. So it's like absolutely enormous. But at the time, I feel like basically 0 chefs were working on climate change. Maybe even today, it's hard to imagine what that would necessarily involve. But so we got underway with a nonprofit called Zero Foodprint, and that's the focus of our work now. We also started running a restaurant called The Perennial, where I met a few of the people who are attending tonight's talk. And at The Perennial, we were really championing regenerative agriculture and carbon farming. And you heard Trevor talk about the Marine Carbon Project. And, we were serving beef from one of the pilot projects from the Marine Carbon Project, Stemple Creek Ranch. Some of you may know Lauren and their great ranch. And, what's crazy is that it's a 3,500 acre ranch. I have data from a few years ago, but basically 350 acres was part of the pilot where they applied compost and also were conducting managed grazing. And so you hear a lot about regenerative agriculture and carbon farming and things. And even within, that field, there's like really quite drastic variation. And a lot of it actually has to do with compost, as Trevor mentioned. And so, at Stumble Creek, they're doing adaptive multi-paddock grazing or regenerative grazing, where they move the cows around to kind of create healthy soil and optimize ecosystem services. And they're doing that on all 3,500 acres. And then the part that has compost applied, which was 350 acres, back in like 2014 or something. I think at this point they're up to 600 acres, but that 350 acres was taking in, according to some of the data that we got from rangeland ecologists, like more than 10 times the amount of carbon that the rest of the ranch was taking in. And so again, even among like regenerative agriculture, there's this huge potential. And so having gotten some new data, I think at this point now, the ranch has taken in as much carbon from the atmosphere and turned it into healthy soil as not burning 1.7 million gallons of gas. And that's with only like a fraction of the farm under carbon farming. And so like the potential is so enormous. Like in the US, there's 760 million acres of land with cattle on it. Quite a lot of it is in the feedlot system, but all of that land is, basically cattle are out there for a year before they go in the feedlot. And so it's like one huge climate opportunity that is available to us through changing food. You saw one of Trevor's stats on the screen, like 47 tons of carbon sequestered in 1 acre. And globally, there's 8 billion acres of farmland and grassland. That's part of the food production system. And so it's like just such a huge opportunity. And so at the Perennial, we were trying to kind of champion these ingredients and tell this world-saving story, and kind of frame it as like, hey, here's the Tesla of food. Like, people, let's start paying more money. Let's start changing some practices on farmland. And I guess we started to feel like things weren't changing quickly enough. And I think at one point, there was a happy hour with, various soil scientists and regenerative advocates and things. And someone told me some stat like, organic is 2% of farmland in the US after decades. In California, it's 3%. Globally, it's 2%. And so this idea that we can like buy the good stuff and the whole system will change, started to feel a little bit false to me. And this is as someone who was, basically like all in with our whole life savings, trying to run a business, buying the good stuff and setting that example. And so in 2019, we formed a collaboration with the California Air Resources Board, which grew to include the Department of Food and Agriculture. And the goal is really just to create systemic change by driving more funding towards the carbon farming practices that Trevor and Amy are, advocating for on a grassroots level. And I think we're trying to like both advocate for and create funding for at a systemic level. But of course, this is like a really big amount of funding, in California, there's something like 16 million acres of working lands. And so to fund this kind of change on acres is like requires a really, really big change in kind of the food economy. But I'm really glad to be actually working on this with Daily Acts in Sonoma and other partners in other regions, because systemic change like that takes kind of grassroots level collective action and like actual individuals making change. So let me share a screen and jump into this slideshow to just get into some of the details. Oops, sorry, I'm in the middle. So I just want to zoom out really quick first and just say, it seems like a lot of people on this call are very well versed in some of these issues, but one of the main reasons that we're interested in this is climate and the potential of carbon farming to be a major and primary climate solution. But I don't know if anybody has seen this before, but according to the UN, and I think this was even a few years ago, there's only 60 remaining harvests at the current rate of soil depletion. And so, as if climate change wasn't serious enough, there's also just this really big issue of like food security and, healthy food and feeding people in the whole entire food system is also kind of like hanging in the balance with soil health. But then conversely, you have like very optimistic analyses coming from organizations like the Rodale Institute. And there's a little bit of scrutiny around their calculations, but basically they have suggested that if regenerative agriculture and carbon farming and managed grazing was applied on literally every acre, that the potential of that carbon sequestration would exceed global emissions per year, that it could take in 55 billion tons of carbon per year, more than all emissions. And so, whether or not you believe that it's like 150% of all emissions or just like 50% or something, like the potential is so huge. And some people on this call may be familiar with a project and organization called Drawdown, which has identified, 80 to 100 climate solutions, ranging from things we know like food waste, educating girls, solar panels and things, to regenerative agriculture and managed grazing. And for me, what's extremely inspiring about the work of Project Drawdown is that it sort of shifts the frame of climate change from something kind of like anxiety inducing and huge and overwhelming to something very manageable. There's many solutions. You can choose whatever speaks to you and then kind of like just start working on it. And they've gone very far in terms of sort of like breaking it down into, for a given solution, like renewable solar panels or something, what would be the plausible adoption rate by 2050? If we adopted it at that rate, how many tons of carbon would come out of the atmosphere? How much would it cost to adopt it at that rate? And how many dollars would that save society, in terms of like reduced pollution and various other things? And then how much profit would that give to energy companies? And so first of all, what's crazy is that to implement all solutions and achieve drawdown, which is like lowering global temperatures, to reduce or remove a trillion tons of carbon from the current, state of affairs. A trillion tons of carbon would take 1% of GDP each year between now and 2050. And so it's like eminently plausible for society to reverse global warming. We just need to start doing our daily acts and start doing our part as soon as possible. And then in terms of carbon farming and regenerative agriculture, what's great is that, it's a great value, basically. So for $180 billion, society could achieve 4.5 trillion in savings, reduced water pollution and better health outcomes and carbon and many different things. And then operators would receive 3.7 trillion in net profit. And so many, many dollars of public benefit and operator profit if we can just get past this inertia of how to change farmland. So sorry, here's that kind of drawdown graphic in more detail. And so definitely feel free to go to drawdown.org and look at the solutions and stuff. It's really incredible work. And in fact, their work doesn't even yet quite incorporate the findings from recent biogeochemistry and the Marine Carbon Project and stuff. And so it's even more possible, to take all the carbon out of the atmosphere and do more than what's shown in drawdown. And so as I was mentioning though before, and as Trevor, kind of prompted me on, I certainly hope that regenerative is the next organic in terms of being on the shelf at Walmart and being ubiquitous and stuff like that. But I actually hope that it far exceeds organic, because I don't think that if regenerative is on 2% of acres in 40 years, that we will have even accomplished what we really need to as a society and what's necessary in order to, really make a dent in terms of climate change. And so I think what we're proposing is basically a new approach to good food. And rather than it be rather than it be farm to table and just a few, middle class or upper middle class or, rich people buying the best ingredients they can, that it really be almost like a fundamentally renewable food economy, like a circular food economy where, a portion of each purchase, maybe it's even just a few cents, is going towards funding a transition on acres of farmland. And so, for me, what was very inspiring about beginning this collaboration with California state agencies was the idea that we could emulate the playbook of renewable energy and start to make really, really rapid change. And so, in Sonoma, you have a community choice aggregation program, Sonoma Clean Power, where, maybe just in the last 5 or 10 years, the whole community has started shifting towards renewable energy. And, that shift is not taking place because, hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of citizens put solar panels on their individual roof. That would be complicated and challenging, and there's logistical barriers and limits and all these different things. That change is happening very quickly because, funding mechanisms and large economic frameworks where collective action can create change. And so, I don't know if this is the exact case in Sonoma, but in a lot of places, it's the utilities company charges you $5 more per month and anybody can opt out. And each month and each year that starts to generate millions of dollars that can go to improve the grid. And so that concept of improving the grid is relatively new for society, but also relatively universally accepted at this point. And so I guess the question that we are posing and hoping, the change that we are hoping to create, is the ability for consumers and citizens to improve the grid of food and to just directly change farming practices and the food system, not by trying to find the best farmer once in a while and buying a few dollars worth of stuff, but rather by just having a few cents from every single meal go towards that change, in the same way that $5 per month on the utilities bill can change a whole city's energy grid. And you can also imagine this happening $1 per month on the waste hauling bill or anything. And so in a lot of ways, I think what we're arguing is that we need to create economic frameworks that allow collective action to very quickly change farmland. And that doing so will create, trillions of dollars of public benefit globally. And so we started Restore California with Air Resources Board and the California Resource Conservation Districts and CDFA, and it really just launched in January. And just a few months, afterwards, coronavirus has radically disrupted the restaurant industry. So I'm not even really sure exactly where and what our trajectory will be, but I'm really excited to be working closely with Daily Acts and starting to do this work in Sonoma and Petaluma. So far, we've awarded 6 farms $103,000 in funding, which will remove 1,200 tons of carbon from the atmosphere. And there's a lot of information on this at our website at zerofoodprint.org. There's a list of restaurants that were participating before coronavirus, and we kind of put things on pause for a few months and are just starting up now. So we're in the process of kind of updating all this. But in your area, we're very fortunate to have Handline as like close collaborators and true champions of this movement. And then Single Thread Farm are in progress, or they've been doing a life cycle assessment for a little while, and are participating through being carbon neutral. And then just this week, someone named Naomi at Lunchette has reached out to us. And so we're really excited to hopefully welcome them on board soon and start a bigger movement in Sonoma with all the local leaders and everybody who is excited about this and, can hopefully use this kind of framework to make really rapid change on acres across the county. I'll stop there and leave as much time as I can for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's really exciting to think about the implications of taking this program and really kind of blowing it up to the largest scale that we could have on climate systems. So with that, let's move into our Q&A here. So I saw that we had a few questions come up throughout the presentation, and we had a few of those be answered by our presenters. But if you have questions now, encourage you to just enter those in the Q&A now. And if the presenters want to turn their videos back on, I can get us started with a question here. I wrote this down as a question for Amy, but it could kind of be adapted for all 3 of you, which is, I was curious as Amy was talking in her presentation of what advice she would have for essentially for bringing like climate farming curriculum or climate justice curricula in general to schools in Sonoma County or anywhere where perhaps it's not already part of the curriculum.
So that's a great question, and is something that I myself, as well as other educators, have been trying to nail down a solid answer to. And the thing that I kind of keep coming back around to, as unfortunate as it is it because of the way that the education system works and the way that funding is directed, it really has to be taken on, at least in my opinion, in a really transformative and permanent way from a state level when it comes to funding. So one of the first things would be an outpour of support for this type of curricula and education at local levels, calling, district representatives, legislators, things like that. And then from what I've heard from the other educators at Mycelium Youth Network, usually what works, at least in terms of something to get in on the ground quickly, would be partnering with a teacher or a specific educator that at a school, and working with them so that they can work that into their personal curricula and their personal lesson plans, and then hoping that the energy is rampant enough, and that students are involved in advocating for it enough that they really ask for and demand the adaptation of this in a more serious way.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope to see that shift happen at state level curriculum.
Yeah, I can add to that, because I was elementary school garden teacher for Oakland Unified School District for a few years, and my position was, entirely funded by the PTA or the equivalent of the PTA. OUSD used to have garden education funding for the district, but because of budget cuts, that all went away, and so schools became primarily responsible for funding their garden programs. And as you can imagine, that's slowly whittled away, and now the pattern that we see is that schools that have PTAs that are that exist in wealthier neighborhoods tend to have garden programs, and schools for Oakland that are in the flats or don't have wealthier families that are in the school system they don't have garden programs. But there are a couple schools so Hoover Elementary in Oakland, they have an amazing garden space. They had a big grass field that was not really in use. And there were a whole network. There was a garden teacher on site, but there was a whole network of community volunteers that, with permission from the school, they sheet mulched the site, and it's now an active garden that's run primarily by volunteers. So there are other ways around it. Does require volunteer work. We've been, one thing about SB 1383 is that through the flexibility of cities using this compost that they're going to be acquiring, we're asking the question, could it be possible for cities to share some of that compost with school sites? And can school sites, they're a different system. I would consider them public land, but they're not like the public land I would consider like a public park to be different management. But it's potentially schools could be a beneficiary of this compost, and maybe that could be a resource for schools to dive back into regenerating garden spaces on their sites.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a comment here in the Q&A. Melissa mentioned that one of the challenges is also having parents who are interested in incorporating these messages in curriculum, because some students are learning these things in the classroom and then they go home and are not being met with a receptive attitude. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Melissa. That's definitely another one of the challenges here. We have a question from Sarah that was actually a question I was going to ask you, Anthony, as well, which is, besides supporting local restaurants that participate in Zero Foodprint, what can individuals do to support and build a path for regenerative farming? Oh, looks like you're on mute.
Thanks for asking that, Sarah. It's a great question. So at the moment, we'd be glad to take donations and send it towards carbon farming projects across California that offer the best kind of carbon sequestration per dollar. Unfortunately, that's kind of like the extent of it in your region. But what I'm really hoping is that, for example, we could get an organization like Recology to, print a sentence on the next bill, allowing customers to check a box and opt in to sending $1 per month or $5 per month or whatever towards regional carbon farming. And then that organizations like Daily X could, take that mechanism and framework and get people to do it and have that be your daily act. And, soon millions of dollars would be flowing towards carbon farming. So, I mean, if you know anybody at Recology, let's make that happen. But alternately, you can almost imagine any funding mechanisms like that as an opportunity. So whether it's if there's a university food program and the person at the dining hall and the sustainability director or something, and if you can get them to print that kind of an opt-in, with 1% of the meal plan, it's $3,000 you're signing up for a semester of meals or something. Would you like to add 1% and send it to local carbon farming? If you can get that framework added, then it gives the Sunrise Movement, or it gives whoever campus environmental studies students something to work with to very actively make a change happen. So I don't, we're pretty new at this, and we're constantly brainstorming and coming up with ideas and stuff for funding mechanisms. But I think I invite you to, try to create a funding mechanism and work on this in your community as well.
That's an excellent idea. I feel like it would be really successful with the campus meal plan in particular. We had another thought in the Q&A from Petaluma's Vice Mayor, Delinda Fisher, says, come to a city council meeting and ask for change. And I would love to second that. A lot of times our decision makers want to pursue these kind of policies and they rely on us to pressure them to do that. So thank you, Delinda. We've got one here from Tor. With the Zombification, which is a term I have not heard and love, of students and teachers these days with remote teaching, are you seeing any schools reaching out for your curriculum to help raise students' future outlook and provide some outdoor off-screen experiences? This is for
Yeah, no, that's great. Yes. Specifically, I can specifically speak to Mycelium Youth Network's outreach with curricula. I do know that in the wake of the pandemic, they are one of the few areas that has actually been able to expand because of COVID. They started, when I did my last event with them, which in January, which sounds like, or no, February, which still sounds like forever ago. They were involved had a direct presence within 2 schools, and then had some after school programs involved with 1 or 2 other schools, along with their workshops that they provide themselves. And now actually they are in, I think, upwards of 9 schools, because there is a need for this distance education. And really, I think it's a really interesting and dynamic way of both dividing the labor, because teachers can't do it all, and it's hard to create curricula that's designed specifically for online that captures students' attention. The one area that they have been having the most difficulty with in, kind of fully reconfiguring for the COVIDification of life is specifically the program that I work with them on, which is Growing Your Health, because such a big component of that was this like hands-on, in the dirt, in the ground, understanding the soil and the plant biology. That was a huge component, and it certainly added to the scientific literacy. And right now we're trying to find out ways of doing kind of like small scale in-person workshops, maybe once a month in like a rotating fashion for students, but it's very much still in flux. And any ideas that anyone has as to how to get around some of these social barriers and distancing things are much appreciated.
I can share an example that's happening in San Leandro right now, and I apologize because I'm not directly on this team. It's part of a project that Stop Waste Schools team is working on, but it talks about how different community groups can come together all around a single project. So the city of San Leandro, and I think their sustainability office, acquired a grant through AARP, which is the retirement the organization that supports retirees. And it was a small grant, a couple $1,000s, but the grant was there to try to build an intergenerational community garden space along the San Leandro Creek, which happens to run right next to a school, Bancroft Middle School in San Leandro. So because of this grant, with the city, we now have 3 different schools that are all within the San Leandro Creek watershed, working together to facilitate a community design charrette. So students are being facilitated and trained to take the ideas of community members, as all happening through Zoom, to try to gather design ideas for this garden space that's along San Leandro Creek behind Bancroft Middle School. So there are still ways to get students involved through leadership opportunities like this design charrette. It's just about finding a little funding source here and finding the organizations that can help facilitate, and then attaching the students to the project. So it's possible, it just takes a lot of work.
Thank you both. I have a feeling we're going to get kind of a similar answer about having to find funding sources for this question, but we have Raja here as a student at Summerfield Waldorf School. which is, I believe, technically in Sebastopol, but it's definitely out in West County. There's a biodynamic farm that students work on as part of farming curriculum. They said they've been helping there for 8 years, and it's given them the knowledge they need to create a small garden at home. I think it would benefit a lot of people to have a farm on campus. So they're wondering if there are ways to have schools that have the space for either a biodynamic farm or maybe even just a school garden, to sort of take that first step or to establish a project like that. It's a big question.
It is, and one of the things in this field is we're all looking for funding, right? And that's one of the things that I think is really necessary in the realm of youth education, is trying to redirect some conventional funding sources and reframe them in ways that attest to food security, as was mentioned by both Anthony and Trevor, in social justice, and healthy soils, healthy community, healthy water. There's a lot of, especially in the wake of COVID, there's this realization that there's this very keen overlap between healthy soils and healthy communities. And so that's a really interesting way to look at potential funding options as we move forward, no matter what the political climate around climate is. Public health is always going to be something that's at the forefront of people's minds. So personally, I think that's a really interesting avenue to explore. And the fact that you, Raja, you get to go to a school that has a biodynamic farm is amazing. I would love to see what you're doing there, actually, and talk with your school at some point.
Yeah, it's a pretty special place. So we have time for just one more quick question here, just out of respect for everyone's time and already being around, dinner time or beyond for some folks. So in Sonoma County, we are debating how to spend PG&E settlement funds for wildfire resiliency projects. The budget's more than $100 million. So Tor wants to know if any of you have ideas for integrating carbon farming with the forest management, vegetation management actions that the county is already looking at using those funds for.
Just real quick off the top of my head, I can't speak too long on this, but the Pepperwood Preserve, as part of has a strong partnership with the Santa Rosa Junior College, has a big focus on carbon farming, which has happened. They've integrated over the last several years, but they do teach about forest management and have some pillars there, and that might be a really interesting relationship to explore, because there, especially when you think of like silvopasturing, which is the integration of rangeland animals within forest systems as a carbon farming technique. And then you also think about the fact that when there's increased soil matter and increased soil organic matter, you also have a lower ground temperature, which has a fire reduction possibility. The links are certainly there. There just needs to be a little bit deeper exploration to really think about how policies can connect those.
Yeah, and I will say this goes way beyond my expertise, but there are definitely connections. So I will recommend folks, if you haven't already, look at the California Native Plant Society. They recently developed a fire recovery resource that it was a great read. I haven't finished it, but it gives a bunch of suggestions for best practices around helping landscapes regenerate after major fires. Just as Amy said, carbon farming is all about reincorporating carbon and organic matter back into soils, and soils that are higher in organic matter are retaining moisture for longer. So, you're changing the humidity level at the ground level. The other thing is, the Marin Carbon Project, which is, we've mentioned it a couple times now. The way that project started was unique in the sense where the the land manager, he was not actually interested in carbon at start. He was actually interested in finding a way to help reintroduce perennial grasses to the landscape and try to get rid of his invasive annual grasses that were growing instead. And he found that carbon farming was sort of like a great way of starting that natural transition into allowing deeper rooted perennial grasses to reestablish themselves on his land. Reestablishing native perennial grasses is a huge step in the right direction to make our landscapes more fire resilient. Unlike annual grasses that die at the end of the growing season and just become like a fuel source that are sitting there in the hot summer months, perennial grasses are either staying green year round or and just not generating as much fuel. So, focusing on reintroducing California native perennial grasses is a really important step that can go hand in hand with carbon farming.
Excellent. Thank you both. So I know we're over time here, super quickly going to cycle through my closing slides and then we'll let you all go. So I just wanted to let you know that we have a few upcoming events with Daily Acts. On October 29th, we have a webinar with the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, which is a very data-informed group looking at how we can create defensible space in ecologically sound ways. So that webinar, Wildfires in Our Ecology, Creating Defensible Space, is definitely going to be an excellent one. And we have a couple of volunteer work days coming up with some well thought out COVID, socially distanced and otherwise safety protocols in place so that you can get outside and be with community. A shout out to our sponsors, without whom we wouldn't be able to bring you events like this at no cost. Much appreciation to all of them. And lastly, feel free to reach out with any questions that you have or any ideas that you have about the topics we've talked about tonight. Lastly, I just want to express so much gratitude to all of you who attended this webinar, but especially to our three panelists. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I learned a lot. I had a great time.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Good luck out there, everyone.
Yeah, stay safe.
Yeah. Have a good night.
Have a great night.